Hello, one and all. Well, we've had about enough of this crap, so we're bringing out the big guns. It's Caleb Hoffman. Let's talk. Hello, one and all. We're hanging out with Caleb Maltman today. He's got a site, CPI USA, Center for Political Innovation. Very, very great stuff. Some interesting and unique philosophical and political thoughts and concepts. I'm sure you'll love it. Everyone should be at least go over there, look around, and there's a lot. Find out the events that they're doing, all that kind of stuff. CPIUSA.org, right?
Indeed. Yeah, that's my organization, the Center for Political Innovation.
Awesome. We'll talk about it a bit more during the show, but first, let's get started on the news. So, we had heard that various and sundry, speculatory theories that all of the people were getting together with Hegseth or Hegseth, whatever, I always screw his name up, to declare World War III on all of the above, right? And I had my theory for those of us who watched the channel. I just felt it was going to be a rah-rah session all along. I didn't think it was going to be anything like declaring some gigantic war or whatever, other than on us. We could arguably make that point, but I will not lead the witness any further. Your thoughts on today's meeting?
Well, it's interesting because Trump has been making a lot of negative noise in relation to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but Russia has said, just ignore this. This is just saber rattling. Negotiations are actually going very, very well, which is interesting. And it, reminds you of like all the bluster that Trump made against North Korea before he actually went to North Korea in his first term. But it is also interesting to watch Russia kind of call Trump's bluff. And now we have this meeting where the Secretary of War, not the Secretary of Defense, right? They've changed the name, right? Gets up and is talking about how overweight generals are an embarrassment and they need physical exercise and wokeness has no place in the military. And very interesting, very, very, very interesting, right? Makes me think about how during Trump's first term, one of the generals resigned in protest of Trump. Do you remember that? And the letter that he wrote basically accused Trump of not sharing his worldview that was hostile to Russia and China and all the anti-imperialist countries. And so now it looks like there's a feeling that maybe the military is not fully in Trump's camp against the wokeness and against the forces that would like to remove him. And so now we see kind of some bluster and some efforts to kind of reassert control over the military. I've often wondered, nowadays with, people talk about the wokeification, which not all of which is bad. One of the things in the wokeification is, it used to be that Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States was very obscure. Now it's widely studied. I think that's great. It's a great book, right? I mean, it used to be only people like me knew about it, only radicals, and now it's pretty mainstream, right? I think it was even on an episode of The Sopranos. They showed it, and and now in colleges, because they go over the history of racism and the labor movement and stuff like that, they read Howard Zinn. But I've always wondered, like, are the kids of Pentagon generals reading the People's History of the United States? I have a hard time believing that at the elite schools that like General, Mad Dog Mattis, his kids are reading People's History of the United States. I can't imagine that he's okay with that. You know what I'm saying? And something I've always wondered, like this wokeness, to some degree or other, the Pentagon can't be totally okay with it. So this looks like Pete Hegseth is kind of pushing back, but it also fits a recurring pattern, which is, why is Trump doing all this stuff with ICE? I don't think it's really about immigration. He's using the immigration issue. It's because we all know the reason Trump lost the 2020 election is because the FBI suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop thing. And he put Kash Patel, who's a longtime critic of the FBI, in charge of the FBI. And James Comey has just been indicted, but the FBI is still full of people who hate Trump. So Trump is building up ICE as his own wing of the federal government that will be loyal to him. And that I think that, again, Trump feels that the CIA in particular are not, his friends. Tulsi Gabbard, who comes out of the Pentagon and is much more friendly to Trump when it comes to issues like Russiagate and negotiations and all of that. She's in charge of she's the director of national intelligence, which she oversees all the intelligence agencies. She gives Donald Trump a daily briefing. And she apparently has been in a push and pull with the CIA. The CIA accused her of outing an agent and she couldn't respond publicly. And there was that whole thing. And so now we have Pete Hegseth, kind of laying down the law when speaking to all these generals to, give this speech about you can't be overweight and we don't want any of this wokeness and all of that. And again, this is a struggle for control of the military and a struggle for control of the policing agencies. And it shows that there are really big divisions within the halls of power. What do you think?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there's two ways to look at it. I agree with everything that you said. But additionally, let's not forget that Donald Trump is, an entertainer, and he does like to make a big splash. Everything that Donald Trump does, here's why I'm saying I agree with you 100%. Everything that he does, I don't think he does things for one reason. I think he milks them for all he can, either willingly or, what did they say, wittingly or unwittingly, right? But this also serves as it's putting him and Hegseth in front of the military and saying, if I call all of you in, you have to come. Right? A reminder who's in charge.
Yeah.
Is what you said. But also outwardly, the other people, the neocons or his enemies or whoever he may see, he gets to demonstrate his power and say, don't forget, I can tell everybody to come here and they'll be here when I say it. And they'll listen to whatever I have to say and whatever this schmuck has to say. They'll listen to it as long as I'm the boss, I'm in charge. He kind of reestablished his dominance both inside the military and in other parts of the government to reestablish, don't forget, I'm HMFIC, right? Head mofo in charge. I think there's that element to it of him making his statement to the military, reestablishing, making statement to other people. I got a lot of horsepower. Don't push me too far. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. And that there are like very odd things going on. For example, you remember how Trump had the military parade and they were so angry about the military parade. That's when they called their No Kings thing. And also the military parade, it just sucked. It was just a really bad parade, right? And people wonder, was that on purpose to embarrass Trump? There was so many things about the parade where it was just not done very well. You almost wonder if it was sabotaged from within.
Oh, yes. I definitely, to me, it was obvious it was.
Yeah. It was,
yeah.
The U.S. Army could put on a much better parade than that.
Exactly.
It was not, and the fact that, there was mockery of it on social media. And then that was the same day they had their No Kings rallies against Trump. I was in LA covering the LA No Kings stuff, and I was getting tear gassed and putting on my mask. There were rubber bullets flying, and it was pretty wild, But that was pretty weird. But then they were so mad about the parade, and they're saying, well, that's like a dictator thing to do a parade. But I don't think it was that. I think that the parade had meaning to rank and file soldiers, right? That maybe it didn't have towards the brass. The brass could care less if there's a parade. The generals are just like, whatever. Okay, a parade. That's great. But to rank and file soldiers, it was Trump saying, I like you. I care about you. The liberals and the Democrats don't respect you, but I'm with you. And I want to restore respect for you in the military, kind of like what he's doing with local police. And that they really wanted to, and by they, I mean the Democrats, the Democrats and other factions, the political establishment really didn't want Trump to pull that off effectively, right? They didn't want Trump to kind of, show the rank and file of the military that he's their guy and he's going to let them, put on a great show. And so that raises questions. The other thing is that, like I said, Tulsi Gabbard comes out of the military, but yet she's so outspoken in being an anti-war voice. Why is that? Because the Pentagon is much more realistic. They run the scenarios all day long. They've got computer programs, and they realize war with Russia and China, World War III is a war that America loses. Maybe 2/3 of humanity dies in the process, but America also loses. And they're not excited about it. Whereas there is this intelligence think tank apparatus. They're not concerned about win or lose. They are just on a mission to spread the Western system and tear down countries in opposition and and that's what they're dedicated to, and that the generals are much more realistic about it. And they seem to be very close to the military contractors, and they want to make lots of money selling weapons, right? They really want to do that. But actual war, like actual conflict, is something people aren't excited about. You remember Ron Paul,
Yep.
and Ron Paul was very much a precursor to what happened with Trump. You couldn't have had Trump without Ron Paul, right? During the Obama years, Ron Paul surged, and he got so much support from the military, right? And you'd think he's an anti-war guy. The military would hate him or whatever, but it's actually the military that was the most supportive of Ron Paul, because they're going overseas and they're like, what are we doing here? What is this war about? There was a girl in my high school I went to high school with. I shouldn't say a girl or woman, but she was a girl when I knew her in high school. And I remember she was in Afghanistan during the Obama years. And I got phone calls from people, and they're like, look at her Facebook. Oh my God. And she was just going off on Facebook. Why am I here? This country is a shithole. I hate being here. I have nothing to do with it. This is a waste of my time. The people don't want us here. I don't want to be here. No one's here. All this government money is being wasted. And me and my high school friends are just laughing. I mean, she's there and she's just saying this is a complete waste. And there have to be lots of people throughout the military who see that, right? So it's very, very, very interesting to see what's going on, and that Tulsi Gabbard comes out of the military, right? She served in Iraq, and she became very anti-war. And I guess Hillary Clinton initially supported her when she ran for Congress in Hawaii, and she was originally a Democrat. But then, she took the anti-war position, and she got kind of marginalized in the Democratic Party, and she was friendly to the White House. And she was for Trump, and now she's the director of national intelligence in the Republican Party. Tulsi Gabbard is a very, very interesting case, and I think she's very, very important. So I don't know. I mean, we have to look at all of this. I mean, it's very, very interesting, but it certainly was not what we all expected, right? Trump changed the Department of Defense to the Department of War. He's got Pete Hegseth giving speeches, right? The other thing that's interesting, though, is Pete Hegseth, his religious affiliation. Do you know which one it is? He's in a rather extreme, he's an evangelical, right?
Okay.
But he's not the same. A number of people in Trump's first term that have turned against Trump were part of these Pentecostal infiltrations of the Catholic Church. That's very interesting. So Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, and Amy Coney Barrett, who's now on the Supreme Court, all of them were Catholic officially, but they got involved in like these kind of Pentecostal religious groups that kind of infiltrated the Catholic Church starting in the 1980s. And like Amy Coney Barrett would say, I'm Catholic, but she's actually on the national board of something called the People of Praise organization, which is a Pentecostal group that meets in Catholic churches, but they speak in tongues and they don't recognize the Pope. And they call themselves a parachurch organization. But they were formed during the 1980s when the Catholic Church was opposing U.S. foreign policy in Central America. And basically, it was people in the Catholic Church who wanted to pivot closer to the evangelical community because they agreed with the Contras and they agreed with what Reagan was doing, funding the anti-communist militias. And they didn't like that the Catholic Church was opposing Reagan. Mike Pence was Roman Catholic, but he had his evangelical conversion experience around this time in the 80s, but he continued calling himself Catholic right up until he started running for governor. And then he just joined an evangelical church. And Mike Pompeo was also originally a Catholic and joined one of these evangelical infiltrations of the Catholic Church. And then he eventually, so that's all very, very interesting. But I mean, and Amy Coney Barrett seems to still support Trump. I mean, she's a Supreme Court justice. She's not making statements, but Pompeo has turned against Trump very solidly. Mike Pence has turned against Trump pretty solidly. So it's very, very interesting. Pete Hegseth is very, very heavily involved in his religious community. And I'd be curious about how that lines up, and there's all kinds of stuff going on now in relation to that. Charlie Kirk, after the death of Charlie Kirk, they're really playing up how religious he was. They had that rally in Arizona to commemorate Charlie Kirk. That was really, it was just a big Christian religious gathering. So it seems like Trump and his camp are really leaning into the religious aspect, but it's different communities. So I don't know what's going on. I'm curious, but there are divisions, big divisions in the back room. And that I would say the Trump administration is not one monolith. There is very big division within it. No question about it. And that's why I think the indictment of James Comey is like the best news I've heard in a long time, because James Comey was part of Russiagate. They lied. That Russiagate lie, if they hadn't done that, the war in Ukraine wouldn't be happening. Let's be real about that, right? That if Trump had been able to take office as he wanted to do in his first term and make peace with Russia, then, you know, he would have improved relations with Russia and things wouldn't have happened. He took office on the defensive, having to prove in the face of, you know, the investigation, special counsel Robert Mueller and all of that, that he wasn't working with Russia. The FBI then used the Russiagate hysteria to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story and get Biden into office. That Russiagate stuff is what prevented an improvement of relations. And
Yes.
it was on the basis of that Biden got into office, made things with Russia even worse, and we got to where we are, where Russia had to start this special military operation. They had to move in and protect the people of the Donbass. They had no choice at that point. They held off doing it. A lot of people, including the Russian Communist Party, wanted them to go in 2014, but they didn't. They held off, and they'd held off, and they'd held off. And with Biden in there, it got to the point they really had no choice. They had to move in to protect Donetsk and Lugansk and defend the people there that have been dying since 2014. They've been bombed, by the U.S.-backed government. They totally disregarded the Minsk agreement, et cetera. So this war wouldn't be happening in Ukraine, and hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Hundreds of thousands of people would be alive if not for the Russiagate hoax. And so the fact that James Comey, who was one of the big, perpetrators of this hoax, he's been indicted. I hope he is only the first one. I hope that after him, they've got John Bolton. After him, they've got, Clapper. And what I thought was really great was, in Tulsi Gabbard's remarks, she talked about how the very same people that lied so that Bush could do the Iraq invasion with weapons of mass destruction, they're the same people that did the Russiagate hoax. And they did it for Republicans, for Bush, and they did it for Democrats, for Obama. It's not a partisan issue, right? That these neocons, this faction, they will lie for whoever will advance their agenda of spreading chaos and instability around the world. And that James Clapper cooked the books when Bush wanted torture, and he wanted, he wanted to invade Iraq on the lie of weapons of mass destruction. And then James Clapper, the very same guy, the first director of national intelligence, he turned around and he cooked the books for Obama so they could blame Russia for Trump winning. And it just goes to show you that it's not a partisan issue. It's the fact that the regime change activists have so thoroughly inculcated themselves in the intelligence community and other wings of the American deep state that they have a lot of power, and that Tulsi Gabbard seems to be in some kind of effort to root them out, even though there's a lot of people within the Trump administration who seem to like them. And so I don't know what's going to happen next. And seeing, how MAGA is divided over Israel now, like never before, that's fascinating to me, right? That in the aftermath of the killing of Charlie Kirk, right, you have Candace Owens and others saying, and Max Blumenthal and others saying, well, there was evidence, there's solid evidence Charlie Kirk was turning against Israel. And that's why he was killed. That's big. Then you have the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, this group that smears people that are critical of Israel, coming out and naming Charlie Kirk's organization, Turning Points USA, as a hate group. Right now, Charlie Kirk's already dead. Why are they doing that? Right. And if it's already been decided that, that Charlie Kirk, they're denying that he was turning against Israel. Netanyahu's out there. Oh, no, we didn't kill Charlie Kirk. Don't believe anything. Why would the ADL now, after his death, name Turning Points USA as a hate organization? That's very, very suspicious. Right. And it's almost like they're angry at somebody. There's something going on. There's more fallout going on in the MAGA world in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk. And there's a scramble. And I don't know what we're going to see out of the White House. I really, really don't.
Let me ask you this before we move on. We got other things to talk about. I talked about something earlier today, and they won't say whether or not there's been an autopsy. I don't know if you've heard that. And an autopsy is required by law, and when there's a murder in Utah, most states. And I just thought they could just say yes or no, or yes, it's in accordance with the law. What are your thoughts about all of these contradictions and anomalies, and dare I even use this word, an actual miracle that was involved? They have a miracle this time, and they didn't wait until a magic bullet so we could use a word like magic and miracle. Preemptively, they came out and said a miracle has happened, a 30-06 lodged under his skin.
Yeah, something's off. Something is way, way off. And I will say that not only is something way, way off about the killing, and like, exit wound, right? You talk about a miracle and all of that, like what's going on there? And, think if there's a miracle, it would, his life would be involved, right? I mean, it's, I mean, it's a very odd miracle. Let me put it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's like just no exit wound. That's very odd. The other thing is that the way all these left-wing people that were cheering on Charlie Kirk's murder went viral. And that was to traumatize, Trump's base, to say, look, there's people out there that want to kill you, want to kill your family. You're in danger. Look at all these people. Look how hateful they are. Look how bloodthirsty they are. That was to traumatize people in Trump's base. And it worked. It worked. And I mean, and then there was that whole pushback to get people fired from their jobs for celebrating it, which as much as I'm disgusted by the people celebrating it, people say dumb shit on the internet. They shouldn't lose their jobs for it.
No.
I mean, if some guy's an Uber driver, he delivers food for Uber Eats, and like, I'm okay. Well, if he hates Charlie Kirk so much, he made a Facebook post. That's none of my business. I don't care. Exactly. And Glenn Greenwald made a post recently where he was pointing out that there's a couple people who were fired from their jobs, and they weren't celebrating the murder of Charlie Kirk. They were just saying, look, I don't think he was a hero, and things like that. And some, like, professors and stuff who actually, they weren't celebrating it. They were just saying, look, I just disapprove of some of the stuff the guy said. I don't think he's a civil rights icon. I'm not comfortable with people putting his face next to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all that. And they've lost their jobs. Why are people losing their jobs for Facebook posts, right? That's cancel culture. That's the problem to begin with, right? So that response of, like, on the right, it was like, we're supposed to then make a directory of everyone who cheered, well, yeah, it's really messed up that people cheered, but, like going after them and stalking them is kind of making the problem worse. We have this cancel culture in politics where, the way that people feel empowered is by taking down not a high-ranking political person, not somebody who's running the government, but some random person somewhere who said something on the internet. This cancel culture, is toxic, and it goes both ways, right? If somebody tweets something about trans people or LGBT, I don't think they should be fired from their job for that. And also, if someone tweets something stupid about Charlie Kirk, I don't think they should be fired for that either. It's just, people say dumb things. I've changed my position on many issues over the years, and I think other people do. And we want people to be open-minded and change their positions. And when people get canceled like this, they dig in, Peter Coffin, a guy I really do respect. You should check out Peter Coffin's work. He's written about the J.K. Rowling effect. J.K. Rowling, what she said was, she basically said, there's some issues here with the trans thing. I'm not totally, it was like a very mild statement. And then the internet went after her. She tried to apologize. It didn't work. And they went after her some more. And then all the people who agree with that position started befriending her. And so then that's become what she's about. It didn't have to be that way. She could have just had minor differences over this issue. It wasn't a big part of her identity. She wasn't thinking about the trans thing all day long, but she said something, and she could, you can't apologize. You can't clarify. Oh no, you're bad. And they come after you. And so your only option is to then dig in. Right. And that's how this goes. And it's really, really unfortunate. So yeah, I don't think the cancel culture stuff is healthy, no matter where it comes from.
Yeah, I'm with you. Definitely. This LDS church shooting is interesting because nothing ever happens to the LDS, it seems like, except, some weird internal stuff. And, here's an interesting group, that it kind of like Scientology is, there's all of these people in Hollywood that are Scientologists, and you look at the LDS and you're like, there's all these people in like the FBI and the intelligence community that, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, that ain't exactly Hollywood, but that group seems to be strongly affiliated with those particular organizations. Your thoughts, Caleb?
Well, so a couple things come to mind. First of all, I want to just say, I'm from Ohio. Mormonism is not a big deal in Ohio. There was like one LDS church in like the county that I was in. I didn't know anyone. I knew they had their own Boy Scout troop, right? That there was the regular Wayne County of Ohio Boy Scouts, and there was the Mormon one, right? And that's kind of how they used to work now. They used to work back then, as they had their own, separate Boy Scout troops. But other than that, it was just not a thing. But over the years, I realized that in some parts of the country, I mean, Utah especially, but also in Arizona, in New Mexico, in Oregon, in Washington State. It's a really, really big part of the culture, right? That almost everybody has that heritage if they've lived out there for a few generations, right? And a lot of people are not involved in Mormonism, but it's part of their heritage. And so I did a deep dive and I researched it. I found it to be fascinating, right? So Joseph Smith was this guy in, I think, in upstate New York, right? And he started this religious group and he found the golden plates and all of that. But when they started out, one of their defining positions was they were anti-slavery, right? And they were part of the Second Great Awakening, which was this mass religious movement in America that was anti-slavery. It was because the slaveholders had so much power over the federal government because of the Electoral College that there was kind of a mass religious awakening funded by the wealthy people in the North to kind of push back against slavery. And out of that comes John Brown and almost all the religious traditions that you associate with America, tent revivals, baptizing people in the river, all this stuff, the hymn Amazing Grace and all that. And Mormonism was like one of the sects that came out of the Second Great Awakening. And originally, they were multiracial. They were against slavery. They even had their own militia called the Avenging Angels that like carried out assassinations of their rivals. And, you know, it's kind of fascinating. And they moved out to Ohio and then eventually to Illinois. And that's where Joseph Smith was killed. And they fled to Utah. And, you know, the reason that they were so heavily persecuted was that they at that point believed in polygamy, which is something that American culture, we just don't tolerate that here. It's weird. You know, it's weird. You know, in some parts of the world, polygamy is fine. You go to the Middle East, you go to Africa, a lot of cultures, hey, polygamy, whatever. In America, for some reason, that just, you can't do that, right? It's still a crime, right? You know, you cannot do that in most states. You know, if you declare that you're married to more than one person, you're going to jail according to the laws of a lot of states, right? I mean, it's interesting that we have rules about that. But, you know, so they went out to Utah and everything changed when they got to Utah. Suddenly they were fighting Native Americans. And suddenly they became a whites only religion and they were persecuting the Native Americans, right? And they were not involved in the Civil War because they were already in Utah at that point. So they were neutral in the US Civil War. And their character had changed. But out in Utah, they were almost like, you could call it like socialism. The church owned everything. Everything was owned by the church. It was like collective property. And they even had a name for their economic theory. They called it United Order is what they called it. And they even argued that communism was invented by Satan as like an alternative, a way to copy their religion or something. So they had basically a central state economy in Utah, which they called Zion. And they were just, and then federal troops showed up and forced them basically at the point of a gun to adopt, you know, to drop polygamy, right? They were forced to drop that. And they were integrated into the United States as the state of Utah. And for generations, the Mormon men would swear a blood oath of vengeance against the American government. You can look this up. Fascinating. Up into the 1950s, part of their ceremonies is, we swear an oath of vengeance against the U.S. government for what it did to us. I mean, that's crazy, right? Who would imagine, right? But then in the 1950s, they were really against communism, right? They're very religious. And they got involved with the John Birch Society, this far-right anti-communist group. And they started kind of sucking up to the FBI and saying, look, we hate the communists. We'll fight against the communists. But J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, didn't like them. He didn't trust them because he thought this is a fringe religious group. But then J. Edgar Hoover died. And in the early 70s, after the death of J. Edgar Hoover, suddenly they started going into the FBI and the CIA. And they're considered ideal FBI and CIA agents because they don't drink alcohol. Because they're very disciplined and they have like a 2-year mission, you know, like a gap program, basically, where they go somewhere for 2 years and they live a very, very disciplined, you know, life, you know, doing full-time church work. And so they're considered like very ideal for those kinds of jobs, but they're kind of like a world inside of the United States. It's like a little like country within a country. It's like a way of doing things. And like if you go out west, if you go to Oregon or Washington State, you know, a lot of people really love board games out there. You know why that is? Because in the Mormon church, part of their tradition is every Friday night, the family stays home and plays board games together. That's part of their religion. So out in that part of the world where Mormonism is just a really big part of the culture, people just really like board games because they grew up doing it. And there's a lot of people that maybe their grandparents were Mormons, but then they just developed a love for board games as a kid. Board games were a really big deal in the Pacific Northwest, right? It's kind of like how people can be culturally Jewish. Maybe they've never been to a synagogue in their life, but they identify with aspects of the culture. You can be culturally Mormon, which I find to be very, very interesting. But in light of the shooting, I want to point out something, which is that, a couple months ago, a video came up in my YouTube feed, and it was this very, very good-looking woman with blue eyes, blonde hair, very good-looking, trashing the Mormon church. And I watched the video, and she's grew up Mormon. She's very mad at the Mormon church. Okay, fine. She feels they're corrupt. She feels it's deceptive. Fine. I watched one video, and then for the next week, every time I opened YouTube, there'd be like 5 videos by this very, very good-looking woman trashing the Mormon church. And then I got an alert on my phone. The Wall Street Journal did a special on this woman about the Mormon church is now facing off with this social media commentator who's going to take them down. And I'm just like, what in the world? And this woman has become a huge social media celebrity, trashing the religion that she grew up in. And she goes against them in every conceivable way. I mean, she talks about the Twilight, the vampire movies, and how they were written by Mormons, and she goes after them, and she goes after all kinds of cultural issues, and it's like this obsessive hatred. And I understand she's probably got trauma. She's probably been hurt. Maybe she's estranged from her family because of religious differences. But isn't there something wrong in our culture when a way to be internet famous is trashing the religion that you grew up in? I mean, something's unhealthy there. Right. And that's very much the age that we live in. Right. Is this age of, they call it anti-fandom. Right. Where you click onto something you hate and you just fixate on hating it. And when this guy went and he shot up this church, I mean, he apparently was somebody, he was one of many people who they've become fixated on their hatred of the Mormon church. And the internet gets them into this downward spiral. And that's a really, really unhealthy aspect of where we're at right now. I'm not here to defend Salt Lake City, the top religion of FBI. They were, blatantly racist until the 70s. I'm not here to say that there's some good group you should go just sign up for, but the fixating, the culture of hatred, that leads to a very, very negative thing. And so that's kind of my reaction to the shooting. What do you think?
Well, you wonder also about this woman being promoted like this, you know what I mean? And this happening, you also have to be suspicious. Are there anti-Mormon entities out here that have some level of I don't know, animosity towards the Mormons? Are they? They're very pro-Israel, though, aren't they?
From what I understand, and I mean, it's weird. They flipped and flopped on Trump during his first presidential run, and that was very, very odd, right? So you remember that the guy who was running against Trump, the main Republican, was the guy from Texas. What's his name? His name's escaping me now. He's from Texas, Republican senator.
Cruz, not Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz, yeah, Ted Cruz. The Mormons were backing Ted Cruz. Salt Lake City was behind Ted Cruz. And it was so much so that on the ballot in the state of Utah, there was a Mormon guy running for president for the Christian Freedom Party who was on the ballot only in Utah to take votes away from Trump. And Mormons were going to vote for this Christian Freedom Party guy and not Trump. And Ted Cruz, he very famously at the Republican convention, he didn't say vote Trump. He said vote your conscience, and got booed. And there was this whole thing, and it looked like, and then also Glenn Beck, the TV commentator, Glenn Beck, he converted to Mormonism. He lives here in New York City, and he had a cocaine addiction issue. He went into recovery, and he converted to Mormonism as part of his recovery, right? And he was really anti-Trump, and he was against Trump, and he was with Ted Cruz. And then at the last minute, you remember what happened? Like a week before the election, the Christian Freedom Party guy said, don't vote for me, vote for Trump. And the FBI reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. And Glenn Beck said, I'm going to vote for Trump. And at the last minute, the Mormons pivoted, and they took a lot of people with them, right? You remember that 2016 election, the FBI was with them, and this candidate out there, and Glenn Beck, and all of a sudden, they went into the Trump camp at the very last minute. Some kind of last minute deal was made. And then like shortly afterwards, after Trump took office, he ended up having to fire James Comey, right? And
Yes.
that turned against him, and it all started up again. And it was like Trump made some promise or some kind of backroom deal had been made. And so that's what, when you talk about this YouTube channel getting widely promoted, right? There are backroom deals like this, and it almost reminds you of the Roman Empire. I go back to the ancient world a lot, but in ancient Rome, they had what they called the mystery religions or the mystery cults. That if you were in the army worshiped the god Mars. And they had a special temple to the god Mars. And the longer that you were in the army, they told you a little bit more of the secrets and the rituals of the god Mars and all of that. And the Navy, they worshiped the god Neptune. And they had a special temple for the god Neptune. And the longer that you were in the Navy, they told you more of the secrets and brought you to more of these rituals. And it was like they couldn't have one religion for the entire empire, right? It was like the army was taught one thing, the Navy was taught one thing, the ordinary people were taught one thing. And it was like, to hold the empire together, they had different, they called them mystery religions or mystery cults for different people. And you can almost argue that Mormonism has become almost like a mystery religion for the American intelligence apparatus, right? That there's a number of people in that intelligence world, FBI, CIA, who adhere to that way of thinking. Right. And it's not something that is very mainstream. Like I told you, I grew up in a small town that was very religious, but Mormonism was just not on my radar. I had to do a whole lot of investigation to find out about it. Right. It's just not something that most people can talk about. And the other thing that I've noticed, they'll knock on your door. The Mormons will knock on your door. The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. That's generally who knocks on your door. Jehovah's Witnesses will talk to you about anything. You could play 20 questions with Jehovah's Witnesses. They'll talk to you about the Bible and this and that and all kinds of stuff. Mormons, they won't tell you anything, right? Would you like a Book of Mormon? Would you like to come to our church? Our church is a great place to raise family. And if you start asking them about Joseph Smith and golden plates, radio silent. They're not going to talk about it. And it's kind of assumed that because you're not part of that community, you won't be receptive to that. That's for once you're already involved, right? Once you've made friends, once you're part of it, then they start talking to you about their more esoteric beliefs. And that's a really interesting approach, right? And you can compare it. My background is with communist groups. And with communist groups, there are communist groups that are like that. They won't talk to you about communism until you've already started becoming an activist with them, and then it gradually comes out. And then there's communist groups that'll tell you everything, the first time they meet you. And it's just a difference in approach. And I find that to be interesting. They both do the door knocking, but one is trying to sell you on their religious beliefs. The other is trying to sell you on, we're a nice community. We're really great. Come and check us out. We're a great place to raise kids. And once you get inculcated into the community, then we start telling you what we believe. And it's different approaches, right? And there's different things like that. I mean, it's almost like sales, right? There's different sales tactics.
Yeah.
Door in the face sales tactic or whatever. So I think that's interesting also.
Well, here's something interesting. You wrote a book on Kamala Harris that actually got quite got much great notoriety during the last presidential election campaign, because it got banned, for God's sake, because it was about Kamala Harris. Kamala seems like she's trying to, stumble back into the picture. I don't know if she's trying to get herself together to run for something. She probably is. Your thoughts on Kamala Harris's reemergence, shall we say?
Well, she wrote this book about how her loss in the election was the fault of everyone but herself. And
how I lost.
It was, and how, Gavin Newsom, when she told him that she was going to be the nominee, he said, I'm out running, I'm out jogging. Can I call you later? And he never called her back. And, and she's got all this stuff about how she feels the Democrats didn't really get behind her, basically. And, it's like she's kind of oblivious to the fact that there was never a primary. Like they basically picked Biden as the candidate. They didn't have any debates. Marianne Williamson didn't even have a chance. They basically just declared Biden the candidate. And then Biden dropped out. Not a single Democrat got to vote for her. And she doesn't acknowledge that as being part of the reason, maybe she lost. And then she also kind of resents. She feels like the party didn't fully get behind her, which I felt like there was plenty of Trump derangement syndrome going on. I thought the whole Democratic Party got behind her. And so then the other thing was when she did her interview on Rachel Maddow promoting her new book, saying, her book is called 107 Days. It's the history of the campaign and what it was really like or whatever. I'm sure it's totally honest, right? That's how these kind of books are. They tell you exactly everything. I'm just kidding. But she basically said that her biggest disappointment is with, the titans of industry. And she feels that corporations are the safeguards of our democracy. And she's mad that big business is cooperating with Trump. And I heard that and I'm just like, what? Like, she wants the business community. She wants Wall Street to overthrow Trump. I mean, it's really blatant. It's funny. It's like usually the argument against Republicans is that they're in bed with the corporations and all of that. And she's saying, well, I want the corporations to get together and remove Trump. They shouldn't let him have control over them. And she talked about how Wall Street is afraid of Trump, how the big law firms and the big tech companies are scared of Trump, and they should just come together with the Democrats and oust him. And I mean, she's calling for a corporate coup against the elected president. And it's like Trump hasn't even done that much, you know? I mean, Trump has been pretty disappointing so far, but yet she's sitting there saying, you know, that the corporations are the safeguards of democracy. Capitalism, I think she said, capitalism is the safeguard of democracy. And, you know, I was like, wow, it doesn't get this blatant, you know? I mean, she's calling for a coup at this point. I mean, there you go. I mean, that's what she's calling for at this point. And
let me ask you this. Well, let me throw this at you. Right down that roll. You've got the Democrats who are in, I don't even know what's going on with that party. I mean, with the numbers. Meanwhile, you've got the Mamdani thing, and a lot of people are very excited over Mamdani. There are aspects of that campaign that I am excited about. But I don't trust all of these DSA people. His wife seems awful spooky to me. I still have found nothing about her before 2022, and I've yet to find a Palestine activist other than her that was beloved by the Washington Post, the New York Times, does documentaries on BBC, but they say she's a activist for Palestinians, and I've never seen anything about her on anything about anything she's ever said, any quotes about the Palestinians, any event she's ever attended about that. Nothing has she ever done or said related to the Palestinians, but the New York Times, etc., describes her as a Palestinian activist. I don't trust Mamdani, but the Democrats are in trouble. Some of them think he's going to be the savior. You know, your thoughts on all of that?
Well, you know, Rachel Maddow pressed Kamala Harris about Mamdani, and she gave a very mild, she said, I support the Democrat in the race. So she wouldn't say she supported him, but she basically said because he's the Democratic nominee, she supports him. She's being very careful. I mean, her husband is involved with, you know, the Israeli lobby with AIPAC, and, you know, Kamala Harris. I mean, it's very weird. I don't know if I'm going to vote for him or not. I am undecided. I mean, Eric Adams has dropped out of the race, right? So it looks like it looked like Mamdani was in for sure because the Republican vote was going to be divided between Eric Adams and Andrew Cuomo. And also Curtis Sliwa is running. He's the Guardian Angels guy.
I think he gets 5 or 6% every time, doesn't he? Which could make a difference in a close race. But anyway, go ahead. Yeah,
he won't win, though. That's
right.
You know, so I thought he was for sure going to win. But now that Eric Adams is out of the race, it's going to be Cuomo, who's a machine Democrat, is a regular machine Democrat, and Mamdani, who's DSA. And I must say, this is, you know, we saw this with AOC, and we've seen this. This is the Democratic Party machine of New York City. That's Andrew Cuomo, and the tech monopolies, and, you know, kind of the George Soros woke, you know, tech monopoly apparatus fighting it out. That's basically what's going on here, right? And that Cuomo, he represents the cops and the firemen and the, you know, city employees and the city unions and the whole, you know, apparatus. They used to call it Tammany Hall back in the day. That's who Cuomo comes out of. And Cuomo is, I mean, he's corrupt as you can get. And I mean, sometimes it gets laughable. I don't know. You remember during the Black Lives Matter uprising, they were taking down statues that were racist, right? That was a big thing. And in New York City, in Columbus Circle, they have a big statue of Christopher Columbus, right? So Cuomo sent, like, there were cops 24 hours surrounded to make sure they didn't take down Christopher Columbus, right? Because, you know, I mean, it's like, and you think about, you know, the stereotypes of the Italian mafia and, you know, he's Cuomo. They're not taking down Christopher Columbus. I mean, it just gets ridiculous, you know, and it's still up. They've still got Christopher Columbus up there because that was one thing they couldn't touch during the campaign or during the Black Lives Matter uprising, and, you know, things like that. And, you know, then there was the whole thing with, you know, the nursing homes, how his decision cost thousands of lives, right? There's that. And, during the beginning of the pandemic, they were trying to make him a hero, and then they turned against him. I will say the whole sexual scandal when he stepped down, that was weird. What he was accused of was very, very, very mild. He was not accused of, and that was weird. And it was also weird, though, that he just immediately, he was like, I'm out, I'm done. Like, and
like a deal was made or something.
Yeah. And that was very weird. And then right as he was leaving office, this is where it gets even more interesting, especially in light of the death of Assata Shakur, right? So right as he was leaving office, he freed one of the Weather Underground terrorists from the New York State Penitentiary, right? David Gilbert, who was involved in the Brinks robbery with the Black Liberation Army, with Assata Shakur's group. They robbed a Brinks truck and they killed a police officer, a state trooper, and they killed, the Brinks guards. Right. And David Gilbert was in prison for life for doing that, right, in upstate New York. And he was part of the Weather Underground. And then he broke away and was part of the Revolutionary Armed Task Force and the Black Liberation Army. And the Revolutionary Armed Task Force, carried out this robbery in like 1981. And he's doing life in prison. And just as he was leaving office, Andrew Cuomo freed David Gilbert. Now, I am convinced that was an FU to the state troopers. I think the state troopers didn't back him. Right? When he was trying to stay in office, and he wanted the State Troopers Association to back him, and they didn't. And so he said, all right, I'm going to release a guy who killed a state trooper. F you, state troopers. I think that's what that was. And that just kind of shows you how petty these kind of politics are. So, Andrew Cuomo freed David Gilbert as he was leaving the governorship of New York. That was very weird. And David Gilbert, he had, he'd written a book from prison and, all this. He was, the Weathermen, they have, Bill Ayers was a friend of Obama, and, they've kind of become icons to a lot of these young anarchists. They look up to them and all of that. And it was kind of out of nowhere he freed David Gilbert. That was very, very weird. But then, so Mamdani, though, has come out of nowhere, right? And you said his wife is a Palestine activist. My understanding is that she is an anti-Syria activist.
Guess what?
Yeah.
I read, in searching articles for her, I saw a couple of quotes in like the New York Times or Washington Post, one of those, the New Yorker, that described her as an activist for Palestine, for Palestinians. That was it, like an activist for Palestine. But that's the only description I've ever saw, and I've never seen her involved in anything.
Yeah,
like that. So I can't find anything about her. She is like the most she's like invisible person, very spooky, and I mean that in a lot of meaner manners.
Yeah, well, and then his mother is a Hollywood director, right? Who's very big in Hollywood, right? And I guess she almost got to direct some of the Harry Potter movies. She was like in the running to be the director for some of the Harry Potter movies, and she's just this well-known like Hollywood person. And his father was this billionaire from Uganda, right? A very wealthy guy from Uganda who I guess the heritage is like Indian heritage, but the guy moved to Uganda and converted to Shia Islam, inspired by the Islamic Revolution of Iran. And that his father was in the Soviet camp. His father was like a Soviet-aligned communist. But then, after the fall of the Soviet Union, pivoted into social democracy, along with Angela Davis and others. And, and so now we've got Mamdani. And part of me wants to vote for him simply because I feel like the election will be a referendum on Israel. New York City is where the stronghold of Zionism is. And Mamdani, he actually says he agrees that Israel has a right to exist. He speaks at synagogues and stuff, but he just said he wouldn't go to Israel as mayor of New York. They asked everybody, will you visit Israel? He said, no, I won't. I won't go there. And he has spoken up against Israel's activities. He's, if you want to talk about, technically, if you're arguing that Israel, quote, has a right to exist, that is a Zionist position. So you could even say he's like a soft Zionist kind of, but he's criticizing Israel very loudly. He is a Muslim. And the election is probably just going to be a referendum on that. And so I hope he wins because Israel is doing bad things. And, Israel has way too much power, not just in the United States, not just around the world, but in New York City in particular. I mean, it's particularly ridiculous how much power Israel has in this city. I mean, so many professors were fired just because they criticized Israel, awful. And then on top of that, there's so much, there's many like local things that go on. For example, in Brooklyn, Williamsburg is a stronghold of the Orthodox Jewish community. And every year they have a ritual where they execute a whole bunch of chickens in the middle of a street. And it's completely unsanitary. It's completely cruelty to animals. It's a violation of every law you ever heard of. They bring a whole bunch of chickens out in the middle of the street, and then they just start whacking their heads off, and the street is covered in blood. That's not allowed. But they're the Orthodox Jews, and you don't want to be anti-Semitic, and so it's allowed. Stuff like that. So the fact that Mamdani is up against a community that has a lot of power and is tied in with Zionism and all of this, the idea that he can push back against that, it sounds good. I think that would be good. At the same time, though, a lot of his policies, they're not going to benefit the people that he claims they're going to benefit. Some of them will. I mean, first of all, who knows what he'll actually be able to do, right? It's a great platform in a lot of ways. Free buses, I'm on board with that, right? Free buses, I'm great, but freezing the rent in like half of the apartments in New York City, that sounds great, but who it will really benefit is the big real estate monopolies, right? They will benefit because no one's staying in their apartments anyway. Those apartments are empty. They're using them for real estate speculation. So it doesn't affect them. Whereas the one, the people who own one apartment building, the rent is going to be frozen and they're going to go under. Right. And that, there's a whole big fight in New York City now about closing Rikers Island. Because they want to turn Rikers Island into high-rise luxury apartments. And the big real estate companies want to get their hands on Rikers Island. A lot of awful things go on in Rikers Island, but they want to replace Rikers Island with jails in the neighborhoods in all the boroughs. And that's not going to be a good thing, right? To have jails in every borough, to have like a local jail, down the street. I mean, people don't want that. So it's a push and pull, and that, freezing the rent. I have a friend who owns a restaurant. She's a small restaurant owner in Manhattan. If he does what he says he's going to do and raises the minimum wage up to $25 an hour or whatever he said, she'll go out of business. She says, I won't be able to be in business any longer. Right. And so, and some of the language he's using, he says things like, he says he's going to tax the rich white neighborhoods, right? That's what he said. What is he talking about? Wall Street people. It's Wall Street that has the money, and they don't live in New York City. They live in the Hamptons, right? But when he frames it that way, that just sounds like, again, it's going to become a push and pull, inciting people against each other. And, it's, I don't know. I don't. And the other thing I will say is he's opened himself up wide open to the attacks from Cuomo, because Cuomo is just pointing out that he's rich. He's rich, right? He's from a rich family. And so Cuomo attacks him and says, hey, you live in a rent controlled apartment where you only pay $2,000 a month. Why doesn't a working family have that? You're taking that away from, and you live in luxury. Why don't you give up your wealth? He's running a campaign based on this idea that wealth is bad, right? Well, that's not socialism. Socialism isn't wealth is bad. Socialism is that we have a system where the way the rich maintain their power is by making everyone else poor and, holding back the economy with overproduction and the irrationality of the market, poverty amid abundance. There shouldn't be rising cost of housing in New York City. It shouldn't be rising like it is, because there's so many empty apartments. Just start taxing the empty apartment buildings, right? Just start taxing every empty apartment unit, and you'll immediately see the rent in New York City drop dramatically, because they'll have to fill up the apartments. The reason that rent is so high is because there's no reason. You don't have to actually have people live in the apartment to make money. It's real estate speculation, right? Which is how Trump got his start. They buy the apartment building, they wait for the property values to go up, and they sell it. Right. And that's how they make their money. Right. And that's the problem, is that real estate has turned into a big gambling casino, and New York City has the most valuable real estate in the world. Right. Manhattan is ridiculous. I did a story about Billionaires Row. You ever heard of Billionaires Row? Yeah. It's near Central Park. It's where Trump Tower is. But there are these apartments that cost like $2 million a month to live in. Unbelievable. But they're empty. They're all empty. There's huge buildings that are very, very tall, and they're all empty. No one's living there, right? But somebody buys it. They wait for the market to go up. They sell it. It's just a big gambling casino. That's the problem. Xi Jinping in China, he said, housing is for living, not for real estate speculation. I like that. That is a good way of putting it. And that's the problem. And so, yeah, that's what needs to be addressed. And I think a lot of Mamdani's policies, they seem good on the surface, but they're just going to kind of crush the small business owner. And they're going to benefit the big real estate conglomerates. So I don't know, but I honestly, though, I still might vote for him because the election is just going to be all about Israel, and I'm against Israel. So there you go.
Yeah, I just see him, the DSA people, I don't trust them. I don't trust Mamdani, but I do agree with you on the Israel issue. So I'd be tempted also just from that perspective, but I wouldn't expect that I'd get anything other than another AOC Bernie fraud who would end up turning on me. But it could be wrong, but I find it hard to believe.
Well, and the fact that he's getting endorsements up and down, that Chuck Schumer and other people, like, what's going on here? If this guy was, I campaigned for Charles Barron, right? I was really honored to do that. 2012, 2013. I was an activist. I was with the International Action Center, the Workers' World Party, and Charles Barron, who's been in the New York City Council for decades, he ended up getting the endorsement to be the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Congress. And he's a former Black Panther. He's got a picture of Lenin in his office. He was a good friend of Gaddafi. He was a good friend of Robert Mugabe. He was a real anti-imperialist, right? Charles Barron. And, he's been to Venezuela and he delivered medical aid to Gaza and broke the blockade along with George Galloway, someone I really, really look up to. And when he ran for Congress, the entire Democratic Party lined up against him. And I have never seen anything like it. And he came close. He actually came close. And I was handing out stuff and putting up posters for him and all of that. But they went all out against him. There were posters all over the neighborhood with Stalin and Mao and Gaddafi. What do all these men have in common? They're supported by Charles Barron, and it was crazy. And Barack Obama, there was a robo ad, on the phone, a robocall, I'm Barack Obama and I'm urging you not to vote for Charles Barron, and they went all out to make sure that Charles Barron didn't win. And it was reasonably close still. The final straw was the day of the election. I will never forget this. Like the day before the election, the New York Post, the front page was David Duke endorses Charles Barron. And I saw that and it was, what in the world? But David Duke, the day before the election, he just decided randomly to make a video, saying, well, Charles Barron, I don't like him, but he's anti-Israel, so I'll vote for it. And it was clearly just to send a message, and they pulled out all the stops and Charles Barron lost. And I feel like if Mamdani was really an anti-imperialist, they would be pulling out all the stops against him. And that doesn't mean you can't still win. I mean, George Galloway got elected to the parliament. They did pull out all the stops against him. You remember that the prime minister said he was so disappointed, and Rishi Sunak, but he still was able to do it. You can still overcome that if you have community organization. You can still win, but the establishment tends to pull out all the stops against you. I'm not seeing that with Mamdani. I'm seeing Cuomo say, okay, I'm seeing, and Kamala Harris is a little more reluctant than some of the others, but most of the Democrats are saying, okay, fine. And that makes me think he's not really an anti-imperialist in any way.
Exactly. Well, what their position is this. We got Bernie, we got AOC, and they're a little bit of a burr under our saddle every now and then, but for the most part, they're compliant. So we'll do the performative, oh, we don't like him, we don't want him stuff. You know what I mean? We'll do that performatively, and then we'll very subtly and gently endorse him. Then when he wins, we know what he's going to do, and we'll continue to gripe. But whenever we need him, he's always going to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, something just doesn't seem right about it. And I feel like they're not giving him the treatment. And so what is weird is that DSA is very much turning into the Muslim Brotherhood. That is very odd to me, because the Muslim Brotherhood, the entire the reason they blew up is they were so against socialism and communism, right? They were blown up in the Middle East, in Egypt, right, against the government of Abdel Nasser. But it seems like, the squad, right? I mean, AOC is not from a Muslim background, but Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar and Mamdani's wife, they seem to be from this kind of westernized Muslim Brotherhood current, right? The Qatar and Turkey are the governments that are aligned with this, it's Al Jazeera. They have the foreign policy of the United States on everything but Israel, right? It's the Muslim Brotherhood line. They're not the Saudis. They're not Wahhabis. They're the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the westernized, pro-capitalism, pro-imperialism, westernized wing of Sunni Islam. That's becoming who DSA represents. And I find that very, very odd. It's very, very odd on a number of levels, but that seems to be how things are playing out. The Saudis historically back Republicans. You know, Muhammad Ali endorsed Ronald Reagan in the 1984 election, and that was because Muhammad Ali had been in the Nation of Islam, and then after the death of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam had liquidated and become Wahhabis. They had aligned with Saudi Arabia, right? And then Farrakhan restarted the Nation of Islam in 1978 with money from Libya, and he tried to go back to their original beliefs. But the original Nation of Islam that was from Elijah Muhammad, after Elijah Muhammad died, his son Wallace Muhammad became the leader. And they said, we're Sunnis, we're Wahhabis, and they were funded by Saudi Arabia, and they became like the Islamic Organization of America. And so in 1984, Muhammad Ali gave his endorsement to Ronald Reagan, and everyone was shocked. Like, why is this civil rights icon, black nationalist, why is he endorsing Ronald Reagan? And he said, well, he wants to keep prayer in the schools. That's enough. But what it was really about was that his religious group was aligned with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was for Reagan. Right. And that's what was going on. And the Saudis tend to be Republicans. Right. So that's very, very interesting. And, and we'll see how this goes. But yeah, Saudi money. I mean, you remember the Bush family. They loved the Saudis, right? The Bush family and all of that. And even Trump, he was over there trying to form an Arab NATO and dancing with the Saudi king and all that. The Saudis tend to be in the Republican camp. The Muslim Brotherhood also tends to be conservative, but in the age of Obama and in the age of Israel, they seem to have pivoted into the Democratic sphere. Very interesting. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, well, it makes sense with the Saudis because they would be, shall we say, closer aligned when it comes to what do they refer to as traditional family? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
So there are a lot of areas that the Democrats promote that the Saudis and countries like that would be less inclined to want to align with. So it makes sense to me. At any rate, Caleb Maupin, thanks a lot. Certainly appreciate it. We've had a great day here. Tell everybody about CPI. A great evening. Tell everybody about CPI USA and where they can go to find out more.
Check us out. I've also written a lot of books. You can check out. I do a lot of books on all this kind of stuff. It's always an honor to appear with you, Garland. You do great work. And, we're living in a very strange political time where things are always evolving. So thanks for having me on. I do appreciate it. And, all my best. All my best.
And since this is on both channels, I guess I'll say thanks for having me on also. All right, everybody. Hey, don't forget, if you're not a subscriber to Caleb's, if you're listening to Caleb or you're listening to me on one of the other channels, make sure you cross over to the person who you're not subscribed to and become a subscriber. Go to cpiusa.org to find out more about Caleb and his good works. Thanks a lot, Caleb. We're out.